Today we are going to be talking about family. This is Now Tell Us. I'm your host, Anthony Moirore. Now, watch this. That's a family. One family. Just imagine. Yes, that's a beautiful setting. I love that. So, why not talk about growing a successful family? We've got a guest. As always, at Now Tell Us, we have guests come and tell us stories. They come and inspire us. They come and educate us on a subject that they are passionate about. Always, we are having a great time. And when I say always, today we are going to have a great time because we have a great guest with us. His name is Jim White. Before we go to meet him, I will remind you to please share this video or this audio, whatever it is that you're listening or watching us from, with all your friends so that they can join in this conversation. If you have a question, please ask it. If you have a comment, we love feedback. Don't hold it. Come join us as we go to talk about growing a successful family. And now, let's go and meet Jim. Here we go. Hello, Jim.
Well, hello there, Anthony. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for coming to Now Tell Us.
Absolutely. I have a quick comment to make on that picture you showed in the beginning. It's
Oh,
hard to
here it
believe
is.
that, yeah, that
Yes.
one that's actually missing. We have two new grandchildren since that was taken, believe it or not. We're up to
Wow.
we're up to 13 grandchildren.
Wow. So these are 11 grandchildren on this picture?
Yep, I believe
And,
so. Yep.
and how many children?
So we actually have six children, and obviously
Okay.
there's some spouses in that picture as well. So we now
Okay.
have, some of the children are married, obviously.
Wow. So six children and 13 grandchildren. Isn't that a big blessing? I call that a blessing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where are you based right now, if I may ask?
Yeah, sure. I'm in the United States. I'm in Indianapolis, which is in the state of Indiana. So right in the middle of the country. We're a middle of the country.
That's beautiful. And is that where you were born and raised?
Yeah, absolutely. I was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana. Yeah.
Okay.
And my
That,
wife, who's in that picture, we actually met when we were in high school.
uh-huh.
We started dating when we were 15 years old.
Yeah.
And this year we will have our 42nd wedding anniversary.
Wow. 42nd wedding anniversary.
Yeah.
Now, you've got a lot to share, I know, and I am wondering whether it's going to be enough the time that we have with us. And but I would like you to speak on whatever it is that you're passionate about, taking from the title of our topic today, growing a successful family. Now, maybe tell us from when you were growing up, even before you came into contact with your wife and started dating. How was it growing up? Were you six children or less or more?
Actually, I just have one other brother. So it's
Oh,
myself and one brother. So I have a smaller family. My
hmm,
wife, though, she was one of nine. So she came from a larger family. So that's what kind of, I think that steered us that direction.
okay.
Um, so, and like I say, we met really young. So a lot of my youth, if you will, it was, she was a part of as well. Cause like I say, we started dating when we were 15 years old.
Uh-huh.
So we've been together, almost it's a lot most of our lives together actually. So
That's good. And I believe I mean, you can't exchange that for anything because that's what you've known. But anyway, in a family, there are a lot of things. And that's why I told you I'm going to give you the freedom to speak on any of the aspects in a family that will make it a successful family. There are ups and downs, challenges, laughter, crying, and all
right.
those kind of things. And now, how has it been? Now you were two, you and and a brother. Your wife grew in a family of nine, so she could tell us a bit more about growing in a bigger family. But you're here to tell us about growing a big family and the experiences that you've been through.
Right. Yeah,
How has it been
absolutely.
from the word go, from when you started, when you married, you
Yeah.
got married? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a couple things I would throw out that, sort of insights gained over the years
Mm-hmm.
is one thing is that and I do a lot of work with parents. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of my focus of my practice is working with parents and helping them through the process of raising their children. And one
Okay.
of the primary messages I try to get to them is the idea that it is a journey. And you kind of
Mm-hmm.
alluded to that, in that you're going to have ups and downs, and there's going to be challenges and circumstances that you encounter along the way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's okay, how do we move past those challenges or effectively deal with them? And
Mm-hmm.
actually, going back quite some time, that you mentioned successful family, I wrote a definition that it sort of spoke to what I feel like is a successful family.
Yeah.
It's been 20 some years ago now, and it was the idea that a successful family is one whose members, they speak with respect, they
Mm-hmm.
honor each other, they provide a nurturing environment, and they empower each other, and they really
Mm-hmm.
truly enjoy being together.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next piece of it is that they have this ability to really appreciate and enjoy the good times, but at the same time, they have the ability to effectively deal with any difficult issues that come their way. And then
Mm-hmm.
finally, there's just a sense of peace, joy, warmth, and love within the home. And so that, to me, it sort of paints the picture of an ideal. That's the mark that we're all striving for
Yeah.
as we move along. But the journey part is, there's going to be times, in our family's the same. There are times when we look like that and we reflect that, but then there's other times when we don't, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's part of that journey that we all go through. And the question becomes, okay, if we're off target, how do we come back? How do
Mm-hmm.
we to get back to that ideal? And that's a lot of the work that I do with parents, is around that process. How do we try to build a foundation to where we don't get knocked off track? And then if we do get knocked off, how do we come back to that? So that's
Mm.
a lot of the work that I do.
Yeah, and it's one thing to listen to someone who's talking from a theory point of view, and it's another thing listening to someone who's talking from practical lessons that someone has learned through the
Right.
journey. And I'm just wondering, and you're from the States, and we are speaking to people from all over the world. I come from Kenya, that's where I come from. And I grew up in a big family. We were seven, and I could see around some other families that were as big as we were. But then you realize that the resources were not quite enough. Now, I guess in the states it is a different thing from when you started raising your children and bringing them up. Were there some necessities that your children missed as they are coming up, they are growing up? Like ours, we had a challenge with going to school. You had to pay for school. There, you have to clothe your family. What were those big challenges that you faced or you've faced all along?
Yeah, and I think here in the United States, we are very fortunate to have access to a lot of resources, and
Mm-hmm.
so some of those challenges were not necessarily the right, something that we faced on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
But then that brings in other issues. There's like right now, for example, I know parents struggle a lot with technology and social media.
Mm-hmm.
That creates a lot of issues within their family. So, and again, it's in an environment where the children, the teenagers especially, have access to social media, and it then starts to affect the way their life experience. And the
Mm-hmm.
parents really struggle with, okay, how do we help them through that? How
Mm-hmm.
do we support them in a way that makes it so it doesn't damage, doesn't cause them a lot of anxiety? That's a lot of what comes up with parents with teenagers right now, is this, social media seems to disconnect the children a little bit from the
Mm-hmm.
family. And then there's this growing sort of ramped up anxiety that the kids are experiencing, which is an interesting dynamic that comes up. And so it's a question, okay, how do we help with that?
Mm,
But I would say no matter where your situation is from a resource standpoint, the premise that, if you want your home, as I mentioned, to be full of peace, joy, warmth, and love, that's not a resource driven a goal, if you will. It's just
mm,
a matter of what's the environment like within your home.
mm,
And one of the key things that I talk to parents a lot about, and I really talk to everybody about, is we all have two competing mindsets that reside within us. And
mhm,
one of them is fear based, and the other one is love based.
mhm,
And what happens is when you engage with your children or your spouse or your community from a fear based perspective or that fear based mindset, things tend to not work as well. And
mm,
that's the source of pain and suffering and anger and frustration. It's when you're coming from that fearful perspective. Whereas if you can start to make that shift and be more love centered or love based, then things work better. There's more love in your home. There's more compassion and forgiveness and all of those kind of attributes then start to appear within your home. And so the first step for us as individuals is to start to be very intentional about where am I coming from? How am
mhm,
I engaging with my children or my spouse or my workplace in some examples? And again, as we become more intentional and can choose to be love based more often than not,
mhm,
life will just start to work better. And so that's part of my message to people is start to learn to recognize and be able to identify when you're fear-based versus love-based, and then work to make that shift because it just has a huge impact. Actually, one of my little catchphrases that I love sharing with people is the idea that a change in perspective changes everything.
mm.
And so if you move from being fear-based to love-based, it just changes everything.
Changing perspective changes everything.
Everything.
Yes,
Absolutely.
and thank you for bringing to our attention that the challenges could be different from different locations. You may not have gone through the challenges that we went through, or the people that are going uh, through the same issues elsewhere. They are not the same ones. But and then you mentioned about the social media aspect, which could be a universal problem. It could be a universal challenge that many parents are having a big
Yeah,
sigh
absolutely.
of relief anytime that that is mentioned.
Yeah.
Coming from a fear-based play point of view to a love-based, how have you been dealing with this, and how can you suggest or advise people from whatever they are to deal with this issue, because it's a big.
Right. And so the first thing to acknowledge is there's a difference between a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old, right?
Mhm,
And that's part of the journey. I mean, your child, if you're working with a child, they are growing and maturing as they move through, into and through their teenage years. And
mhm,
so we have to, as parents, we have to be willing to move along that journey with them. And
mhm,
my point being is that the relationship that the 12 or 13-year-old has with social media or what's appropriate may be different than when they're older. So that's just the first thing to recognize. And we have to, and to be quite honest, 5 years from now, this whole social media world may be completely different than it is now just
mhm.
because technology continues to evolve, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you mentioned that this is being live streamed on TikTok. I mean, you don't have to go back very many years and
Mm,
TikTok was not a thing, right? It
sure.
wasn't
Sure.
even there. And
Mhm,
so it's just ever evolving. And that's why that idea of a journey is a big part of this.
mhm,
And part of what I point to with parents is social media and the technology in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But
mhm,
if it's irresponsibly used, it becomes a bad thing. It
mhm,
can disempower or damage the teenager. And so the analogy I draw to it a lot of times is the idea of a car. I mean, one of the big rites of passage for a teenager, at least here in the States, when they turn 16, they get their driver's license, right?
mhm.
And now they can go and drive a car.
Yeah.
Well, a car in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it can be an awesome thing for the family when that teenager starts to drive.
Mm-hmm.
But that same car, if it's used irresponsibly, can be very, very dangerous, right? If
True.
they drink and drive, or if they, if they drive recklessly, I mean, it can be very dangerous. And so
True.
that's the first thing I would point out to parents, is that the technology and social media in and of itself, it's not that it's the bad thing. It's just, how do we have our children engage with it? And how do
Mm,
we, and then the other thing, and you mentioned fear-based, the fear-based approach, when you're fearful, a lot of parents then try to control everything that their child's doing, because
mhm.
they're afraid the child's going to make a bad decision, or they're afraid that the child's going to make a mistake. And so the parent steps in and tries to control everything.
Yeah.
They make all the decisions. Well, that turns into a huge conflict between the parent and the child, especially a teenager, because that teenager wants to have some autonomy, right? They're starting to want to be able to manage their own life.
Mhm.
And so that's the first natural conflict that starts to pop up. And the alternative, parents will say, well, if I can't just let them go, right? They don't know what to do as the alternative to trying to control everything. And so I like to introduce this idea of empowerment. What the parent can make the shift to trying to empower the child to make a responsible choice, as opposed to trying to control what the child does.
Mhm.
And it's a life lesson. You're giving that child skills that they'll use forever, right? So
Mm,
you have a 14-year-old that's on the phone too much. The control approach would be to go in, take the phone from them, and say, you can't have it after 9 o'clock in the evening, right?
yeah. Yeah.
And so the parent continues to do that. The alternative, the empowerment approach, is to empower the child and work with them to where they make a decision. You know what? I need to put my phone down at 9 o'clock because it's getting in my way.
Mm,
So it's they're doing it on their own. They're making the responsible choice.
mhm.
And if they can start to develop the ability to be thoughtful and to be able to make that responsible choice, again, that carries with them into their adult life. Whereas
Mm,
if the parent constantly controls everything, they turn into, they become 20 years old. Now they don't know how to do that for themselves at that
mm.
point.
Yeah. Give us
So
some
it's
ideas
been,
on some tips and tricks on how to achieve that.
well, and it's a shift. I mean, parents have to start to think in terms of, how do I empower the child?
Yeah.
And it's a longer term game. That's
Mhm.
the part that sometimes parents struggle with, is you're making you're trying to build a foundation. Think of it as foundational.
Mhm.
And it's, building that foundation takes time, and you're trying to develop their principles, values, and beliefs. And like, one of the questions that I love asking parents about, things that are going on in their life, and then I encourage them to talk to their kids about, is, that social media. The question is, how is it serving you right now? Or
Mm,
is it empowering you, or is it disempowering you? Is it hurting you in some way? And
mm,
to have the child start to think that, oh, it can be both. If I'm staying up all night and not getting proper sleep, that's an example of social media. Not, it's disempowering to the child then, or it's disempowering to me.
mm,
As opposed to, if it allows me to stay connected to my friends and know what's going on, that's an empowering scenario. And
mhm,
to start to be able to distinguish and recognize, again, it's that being able to distinguish what's responsible and what's not responsible, in terms of, how is it serving me? Is it helping me or serving me, or is it not? And if
mm,
it's not, then I need to make a decision to do something different. And so it's having those kinds of conversations with the teenagers, for example, and engaging with them. And it again, you can influence them and empower them, as opposed to trying to control what they do.
mm,
And it's a different mindset. To be honest, it's more love based,
mhm,
because and another piece of this, and a lot of times parents, I have these. I'll challenge them. I say, here's some things you shouldn't do anymore, and like, one of them is fix your teenager's problems.
mhm,
A lot of times parents want to run in and rescue or fix the problem. Well, one, it doesn't give, you're not giving that teenager the opportunity to learn how to solve their own problems.
Mm-hmm.
You're sort of robbing them of that. And interestingly, the underlying message when you do that is that you don't believe they can solve the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's a
Mm-hmm.
disempowering belief, and it's a fearful belief. You're fearful that they can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you come from that love-based perspective, you see the potential and the strength in the child, and you believe in them, and you believe in them to the point that if they struggle, if they make a mistake and create some problems for themselves, you know that they have the ability to get through that. They
Mm-hmm.
have some resiliency, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and can work their way through that. And so, learning to take that approach can just have a huge impact on that teenager as they move through those teenage years. That's a
Mm.
long answer, but hopefully there's some insights in there.
Is a good answer. And you mentioning that the social media issue or challenge, I know you've also encountered some other problems or challenges that the parents have been facing as they are trying to bring up a family, a successful family in this case. Could you mention a few that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, it's every child is different and every scenario and situation is different. And so your listeners are going to have lots of stories too, but it's everything from, I mentioned, the car, for example. We
Mm-hmm.
had one of my teenage sons got himself in a real pickle or an issue with a car. He basically was reckless driving, speeding, ended up having to go to court and just all of that. But that's just an example of something that happened. But in hindsight, and actually part of the approach is sometimes the parents will have a child will get themselves in a difficult spot like that,
Mm.
and their view of it is, oh, this is a huge problem, and this is so bad. When it happened, our view of it was, this is awesome. This is an opportunity for him to grow and learn and mature. There's possibility in this circumstance if
Mm.
we approach it from, okay, what are the lessons to be learned? How can this help move him along his journey? And it's just a mindset. And I've heard before this quote, it's the idea that sometimes people have the perspective, and it's a fearful perspective, that things or circumstances are happening to them. And the flip of that is that circumstances are happening for me. They're happening for my benefit. And I
Mm-hmm.
just got to find that benefit, right? And then be able to work that and work towards that benefit. So that's an example of one of those. But then we had um, other issues around just school and doing well in school. We had one of our daughters had some, when she went off to college, got a little bit too deep into like drugs and alcohol
Mm.
as well. So everybody has their circumstances that pop up, and we've had our share as well. And,
Mm.
and that's where I mentioned when we started talking about the definition of a successful family, it's being able to overcome those difficult circumstances, because it's not if they're going to happen, it's just when. And then the question is, how do you respond to it, and how do you learn and grow from that,
Mm.
whatever that circumstance might be. And I mentioned some that were self-inflicted, but we have others that are just happen. The passing of a grandparent, for example,
Yeah.
can be very traumatic,
Mm-hmm.
for the us as the child, and our children as the grandchildren. And that's part of life, right? That's one of those circumstances that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you again rally around that, and find the blessings in it, and approach it from a love-based perspective. So it can be sort of, those kind of circumstances can happen as well. And
Mm.
so, and like I say, we've had our share, as I'm sure all of your listeners can make a long list of the kinds of things that can happen. The
Yeah.
question is, how do we use those to move us along our journey?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. And yeah, it's true. Some of the listeners could add the challenges that they are going through or they went through as they are bringing up their family. Now, we are talking about the family, but I've noticed that you're paying much attention to the teenager. Why so?
Well, a lot of the work I do is with parents with teenagers, and
Okay.
I published a book that was directed towards helping parents with teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's just it's a focus, a part of my practice and what I do. There's an element of it that's really fun, and it's a challenging time for parents, and
Okay.
that's part of why it comes up a lot in my practice.
Could this be the book you're talking about?
Yep, that's it. How to be the parent your teenager needs you to be.
Yeah.
So it's the fundamentals, and there's three core fundamentals. I'll just go ahead and share them. But then this really applies to younger children as well. It's just a little bit different in how you might actually execute them, but
Mm-hmm.
the same concepts. So the first fundamental we've talked some about it, which is mindset, the mindset of the parent, and trying to be aware of when I'm being fearful versus when I'm in a love-based mindset, and being intentional about choosing love. So
Mm-hmm.
that's step number one. The second fundamental is all around building connection. How do I deepen and build connection with my teenager in the case of the book? But again, this applies to if you have a second grader or 10-year-old or an 8-year-old. The question is, how do you build that bond or that connection with them? And
Mm-hmm.
in there, I have 9 different strategies for doing that, which I'll just share. Like one of them, for example, that goes across all ages is the idea of being playful.
Mm-hmm.
Being playful is a great way to build connection.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the picture you saw, I have a bunch of grandchildren. So like my 3 or 4 year old grandchildren, being playful with them is wrestling around the ground, picking them up and holding them upside down. It's doing stuff like that. That's how you connect, right? You're building connection with them.
Yeah.
Now, a teenage son who's 16, maybe being playful as you go out in the driveway and you play basketball together, or maybe you play video games together.
Mm-hmm.
If it's one my wife does, I have a daughter who our youngest is a daughter, and my wife and this daughter love to sing show tunes together, and so they'll put on the music and they'll put on Hamilton or one of the musicals, and they just sing together, and
Mm-hmm.
it's playful. So that's an example of building connection. And part of my assertion is that a great deal of the problems parents struggle with can be resolved if they deepen that connection with the child. Because a lot of times, another one of my little catchphrases is that any of your child's bad or unwanted behavior, it's really just a call for love.
Mm-hmm.
They're feeling isolated, they're feeling disconnected, and the first priority is to reconnect with them and give them the sense that they are unconditionally loved. And if you do that, a lot of times that bad behavior goes away. And if you think about it, they're calling out, they just don't know, especially little children.
Mm-hmm.
They're calling out and trying to get the parents' attention, saying, I need you, I need to be connected. They just don't know how to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
so it comes out as bad behavior a lot of
Mm.
times. And the teenagers, they'll do the same thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the second fundamental. And then the third fundamental is to empower your children to be their absolute best. And it's
Mm-hmm.
all about making that shift to empowerment. And how do I, don't control everything that they do? How do I give them more and more responsibility and trust in them to make the right choice, to make the right decision? And again, I do a lot of work around teenagers, but it starts when they're little. You can
Mm-hmm.
do that. I mean, the classic example is, you have a 4 or 5 year old child. If when it's time for dinner, if you ask them if they want the blue cup or the red cup, you're turning over some control to them. You're
Mm.
giving them a choice and having them be thoughtful and say, okay, which, you're starting that process. And that's a simple question, but it's a way to help them start to engage and have them be thoughtful and have them take ownership in their decision and make a decision. And it takes practice. So that idea of empowerment, and how can I use my circumstances to empower my child to move forward, and again build those principles, values, and beliefs that are love based. And that's the other part we haven't really talked about, but part of the goal is to have the child take on those love based principles, values, and beliefs, so that that's the way they engage with the world, right? That's
Yeah.
ultimately where we want to get them to.
Yeah. Wow. That's very good. Thank you very much for everything that you're shared with us in this episode. But we've got so much to cover, as I said, over this short time of uh, period of time that we have in this episode. But I'm curious, how is it working with families? I mean, is it only one on one? I mean, in person? Do you do it virtually? What are the programs like?
Yeah. So thank you for asking. There's multiple approaches. One is the book. A lot of people buy the book and read it, and hopefully they get insights and are able to implement some
Mhm,
strategies from there. I do one-on-one coaching with people, and it's typically via Zoom kind of an approach, so they can be anywhere in the world. And we'll do one-on-one coaching. I also do workshops in settings like, for example, in about a month, I've got a parenting conference a local church is putting on that I will be doing some workshops at that conference.
mhm,
So I do speaking as well. And then the other piece, and I'm working on right now some online digital courses also. One of them that I'm putting together, it's going to be the primary, sort of like the flagship course, if you will. I'm calling it a 28-day parenting boot camp. And
mhm.
so the premise is to get some of these basic skills, teach them, and then have people go out and try to apply them over a month-long period. So it's like there's a course or a workshop, go try to apply some stuff, come back the week later, second workshop, go apply some more. And so it's like an online course at that point. So that's coming as well. It will be just another way that I can engage with people.
Wow, that's beautiful. And how will people find out what's happening in your world?
Yeah. So my practice is called the Family Enrichment Academy. So
Mm,
they can go familyenrichmentacademy.com and find out, connect with me, find out about what we're doing. I do post a lot of, much like what you do, regular content that's just available on YouTube or our blog as well. And so some people, that's the level of their engagement. It's the quote unquote free content, but they engage and hopefully are able to find some value in that. But yeah, they can go to familyenrichmentacademy.com and learn about what we're doing.
okay, that's beautiful. So, everyone out there who's watching or listening, go to familyenrichmentacademy.com and connect with Jim, get the book, and get to see a few more photos. I guess I can see photos all over his wall when where I'm looking. I guess they're also on the website, are they?
Yeah, there's some there as well.
Maybe.
And
So,
I need to update. We're going to get some new pictures. We actually have everybody coming here in August.
wow.
We're going to get some new pictures with new babies that aren't in the old one. So
I, I guess that's a day that I mean, you're the king when
yeah,
everybody is around, and it's a beautiful one. I've experienced some of those occasions when the big family comes home during the holidays, and there's nothing that can beat that.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
absolutely. And it's hard to get everybody together because our kids are a little scattered, but it's a blessing when we do. We get them all together.
Yeah,
It's a true joy.
yeah. Keep on making those beautiful pictures. I mean,
Absolutely.
growing your family in a beautiful way that you pass a message out that yes, it's true, you can have a close knit family and a successful family where each family member respects one another despite any
Absolutely.
challenges that you may be going through.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been quite an honor having you on our episode today, Jim. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, we are almost coming to the end of this show, but before we go, we always appreciate if you would leave us with a few words that we should always remember. Which are they?
Well, I mentioned a couple of them already. The first
Yeah.
one, and one of the main ones, is that a change in perspective changes everything.
Mm.
And for people to keep that in mind, and if you find yourself in a situation where you're frustrated or angry or disappointed, it's a question of, okay, how else can I look at this? That's the question. How else can I look at this? Or if I looked at it from a loving perspective, what would I see? And so that would be something I would leave. That's just so impactful as a way to help people move forward in a situation rather than getting stuck.
Wow. Wow. I've got nothing to add on that. Those are beautiful words. And I believe that the person who's watching or listening has walked out with something valuable today from this episode. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Yes, this has been Now Tell Us. I've been your host, Anthony Morore. And together with our guest, Jim White, we are saying, bring up a successful family. Yes, you can take it from Jim White and run with it. Bye for now. Bye.
Goodbye.